Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. Topics for tonight are Venezuela's election, is war, of course, in the Middle East, inevitable, or I should say in West Asia, inevitable. Also, a third topic is, are the Dems going to have to face up to Gaza during their convention? And our final topic is, will the ICC ever act? So that's what we're going to cover tonight. Steve Wolfbrand is here. Hello, Steve. It's very nice to see you. Let's get right into the goings-on for the day. Specifically, Venezuela. There was a pretty good piece I picked up in Los Angeles Progressive that I thought covered things pretty well. The title of it is Media Coverage of Venezuela's Presidential Election Normalizes U.S. Interference. And the subtitle, Washington is not interested in democracy in Venezuela, but rather is keenly concerned with the Caracas's geopolitical role as an exemplar of independent sovereignty from the empire. This was written by Roger D. Harris and Peter Bolton and was published by Los Angeles Progressive on August 10th, 2024. There's no caption under this, but that seems to be a Venezuelan boy standing up against a backdrop on a wall. I should say, a mural. Corporate media's coverage of Venezuela's July 28th presidential election is akin to an investigation of a homicide that is focused not with identifying the murderer, but with an unpaid parking ticket of the victim. Interesting way to put it. Likewise, the media has shifted the narrative into the minutiae of electoral procedures, ignoring the much larger issue of U.S. interference in the internal affairs of another sovereign country. What? The United States interfering in elections in another sovereign country? Internal affairs of another sovereign country? Nowhere in the corporate media is there even an inkling that U.S.-imposed regime change activities in Venezuela or elsewhere might violate some basic principles. What kinds of basic principles? Well, I guess they're referring to basic principles of international law. Or maybe the things that happen to us, which we loudly complain about. Anyway, the subtitle of the next portion of the article is U.S. is not interested in democracy. Ours is a homeland with the likes of George Clooney and Melinda Gates have the prerogative, because they are rich, to demand that a sitting president abandoned his re-election bid. In this, quote, land of the free, unquote, corporations are considered persons. Political bribery is an exercise in free speech. And no candidate for public office is competitive unless they accept bribes from corporate interests. Yet Washington considers itself to be the ultimate arbiter of what constitutes democracy in other countries. The truth is that Washington is not interested in democracy in Venezuela, but rather is keenly concerned with Caracas's geopolitical role as an exemplar in independent sovereignty from the empire. Whose empire? What empire? Why, the U.S.'s empire, of course. For that reason, Obama and every subsequent U.S. president has declared Venezuela to be, quote, an unusual and extraordinary threat, unquote, to U.S. national sovereignty. Of course, the notion that Venezuela poses a national security threat to the U.S. is preposterous. Former U.S. President Trump correctly identified Washington's actual motives when he openly boasted, well, said the quiet part out loud, right? Quote, when I left, Venezuela was ready to collapse. We would have taken it over. We would have gotten all that oil, unquote. Similarly, Biden's four-star military commander for Latin America, Laura Richardson, opined, quote, the importance of the region cannot be overstated enough. The proximity, number one, but all of the resources. The hemisphere is very rich in natural resources, unquote. Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves. U.S. hybrid war against Venezuela is the biggest obstacle to free and fair elections. The Venezuelans went to the polls with the gun pointed at their heads. This is because a vote for the Bolivarian revolution socialist project would de facto mean a continuation and likely intensification of the U.S. hybrid war. In other words, one purpose of the coercive measures is to incentivize Venezuelan voters to vote for the U.S.-backed opposition and disincentivize them to vote for the Chavistas. So hell-bent. Oops, sorry about that.
Hi, LA Progressive friends. We're back here.
Sorry about that. So where was I? So hell-bent has Washington's determination been to affect the outcome of the election that Venezuela now has some 930 unilateral coercive measures imposed on it by the U.S., making it the second most sanctioned country in the world after Russia. God. Washington Post carps about the, quote, overuse of sanctions, unquote, because it, quote, risks making the tool less valuable, unquote. Besides, quote, Wall Street power brokers started to grumble about the costs of complying, unquote, with the unilateral coercive measures. Further, quote, Sanctions make it risky to depend on dollars, unquote. Pity the poor banker, we are told, but damn the people of Venezuela. While correctly labeling the U.S. efforts as economic warfare, neither the WAPO, the Washington Post, of course, nor the other media inform their readers that these unilateral coercive measures, euphemistically called, quote, sanctions, unquote, are illegal under international law. The charters of both the United Nations and the Organization of American States, and even under U.S. domestic law. Take, for example, the recent program on Amy Goodman's Democracy Now! Ms. Goodman has come a long way from her humble origins as an alternative news source. She interviewed Jeff Stein with the WAPO about the efficacy of what is in effect collective punishment. The thrust of the interview was the angst over the so-called sanctions not, quote, working, unquote. That is, not achieving regime change, despite the horrific toll they're taking on its victims. Goodman, for her part, was not so rude as to ask her guest whether the U.S. should be in the business of overthrowing governments not to its liking, or even query about the legality of sanctioning 1/3 of humanity. Throughout the interview, Stein used the term, quote, we, unquote, to describe the actions of the U.S. government. Any pretense of a separation between the reporter and the subject being reported is dropped by such stenographers for the State Department. I guess I have to comment here. Jeff Stein is normally considered by many of the progressive side commentators as being a relatively good and objective reporter. Okay, I take the point of these two authors in this interview. There was no separation between the reporter and the subject being reported. U.S. planned to claim fraud all along. In this election, it's far from the first time Washington has tried to interfere in Venezuela's democratic processes. Nicolas Maduro won the Venezuelan presidency in 2013 in a constitutionally mandated, quote, snap election, unquote, after the untimely death of his predecessor, Hugo Chavez, founder of the Bolivarian Revolution. The U.S. was the only country in the world not to recognize Maduro. Why not? Why didn't we recognize Maduro? Because we just didn't like the Bolivarian Revolution. That's why. For the 2018 election, the U.S. claimed fraud 6 months in advance. Washington ordered its Venezuelan collaborators to boycott the polls, going so far as threatening sanctions against a moderate opposition candidate for running anyway. Regime change could be accomplished, Washington reasoned, by the 1-2 punch of the impact of the collapse in international oil prices on the petro economy and U.S. coercive measures designed to impede recovery. But this time around, conditions were different. Venezuela had reversed the economic freefall and begun to diversify the economy. GDP growth is projected to be amongst the highest in the hemisphere. Under such circumstances, boycotting was out of the question. Instead, Washington adopted a belt and suspenders strategy of contending in the presidential election while setting the stage to claim fraud if their preferred candidate did not prevail. Given the pain of sanctions on the Venezuelans, Washington might have allowed a centrist opposition candidate to emerge and banked on a repeat of what had happened in Nicaragua in 1990. The leftist Sandinistas were voted out of office then under the threat of a continuing U.S.-backed Contra war. However, the U.S. chose to promote the far right, as in Venezuela, Maria Corina Machado, who they knew had been banned since 2015 from running for office because of past misdeeds. Eventually, the completely unknown Edmundo Gonzalez, who had no previous electoral experience, was chosen to run as Machado's surrogate, given her electoral disqualification. While the infirm Gonzalez convalesced in Caracas, Machado barnstormed the country carrying his paper image. The campaign vowed to privatize the national oil company and promote a strongly Zionist foreign policy. Foreign Affairs reported on how the opposition united around Gonzalez. In fact, 9 opposition candidates appeared on the ballot. Not a lot of unity there. You'd also read that Senora Machado, or Senorita Machado, I'm not sure which she is, quote, won the opposition primaries by a landslide. You would not know that she circumvented the official electoral authority. Instead, she staged a private primary run by her own non-governmental organization, a recipient of U.S. funds earmarked for regime change. Her 92% win in a field of 13 candidates was highly suspicious. When other candidates called fraud, the ballots were destroyed. Most significantly, Foreign Affairs admitted that the far-right coterie is largely a Yankee astroturf operation. Quote, in the absence of this sustained regime change effort over successive U.S. administrations, the Venezuelan opposition may well have boycotted the 2024 election entirely. Washington's approach toward Venezuela furnishes a remarkable example. The author of this article should know Jose Ignacio Hernandez was Venezuela's pretend attorney general under the now disgraced Juan Guaido, quote, interim presidency, unquote, farce. In the next section, U.S.-based candidate never agreed to be bound by the election results. While weary of the Yankee hybrid war, many Venezuelans also deeply resent the far right, which had called for even harsher measures and military intervention. The massive outmigration from Venezuela, fueled by U.S. coercive measures, had also disproportionately eroded the opposition's political constituency because the affluent have better means to leave. In other words, the sanctions are driving the affluent out of Venezuela, leaving the less affluent still there to vote for Maduro and also the revolution. Tellingly, the Machado-Gonzalez campaign had weeks before the election signaled that they would not abide by the results if they lost. Oh, we're familiar with that particular tactic, right? Upon announcement of the official election results, rampaging opposition elements, emboldened by U.S. support, killed Venezuelan security personnel and massively destroyed public property in what the Venezuelan Canadian sociologist Canadian sociologist Maria Paez Victor called, and quote, attempted coup, unquote. The wave of violence had since largely dissipated in the face of huge demonstrations supporting Maduro. The government's civic military union held firm, chastened by its failure to overthrow the Bolivarian revolution by violence or by the ballot. Washington, as of August 6th, supports actual negotiations with Maduro and will not call Gonzalez, quote, the president-elect, according to the Miami Herald. This is a sign that regime change advocates have downgraded their objectives for now. So who won? Edison Research's election exit poll found 65% for the US-backed candidate, 31% for Maduro. An exit poll by Hinterlaces had the opposite result, specifically Maduro 55% and Gonzalez 43%, similar to the official results of 51% for Maduro and 44% for Gonzalez. Hinterlaces is a long-established and respected Venezuelan polling firm whose owner has been critical of the Maduro administration. Edison, on the other hand, works for CIA-linked U.S. government propaganda outlets such as Voice of America, which are operated by the U.S. Agency for Global Media, quote, a Washington-based organ that is used to spread disinformation against U.S. adversaries, unquote. The question remains, was the Venezuelan election free and fair? However you weigh the evidence, at least some skepticism is warranted regarding sources that brought us the Iraq War based on, quote, weapons of mass destruction, unquote. Moreover, we must ask whether anyone should look up the U.S. as a good arbiter of electoral integrity when it has constantly intervened in other countries' elections. As Mexican President-elect Claudia Sheinbaum has counseled, quote, we should leave self-determination to the Venezuelans, unquote. And that is the end of this very well-structured and well-written article. I thought the arguments in it were very sound. I thought the characterizations of people and efforts were right on the money. I think the critique of U.S. media was also sound and on point. And I believe that its finding that the Venezuelan election was won by Maduro and by the revolution there was also a very accurate finding. So there you have it. I don't see many comments thus far. Only a hello from Steve Wolfbrand. But going on, the next piece is from the UN's Review, a favorite source of mine of late, because it's a place to find both Pepe Escobar and Alastair Crooke and Phil Giraldi, a number of very good writers who, in my estimation, tell the truth about international relations. This one is by Alastair Crooke on August 12th, the one that I have just shared. The title is, quote, an intricate fabric of bad actors working hand in hand, unquote. So, is war inevitable? That's the title. This piece was published 1 day ago on August 12th. it's a pretty good piece. Here's a picture of Kamala Harris with Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu did not appreciate Iran's moderation. He doubled down on war, making it inevitable sooner or later. That's the caption under it. I have a comment on that. The earlier retaliation in April, of Iran, against the intolerable Israel attack, on Iran's embassy in Syria, was very wise, in its moderation. It was planned and executed to show that Iran had the capability of devastating Israel without actually devastating Israel. It was very, very well structured and very, very well executed, giving the Israeli Iron Dome defenses and the various defensive actions of Israeli allies plenty of warning about how to respond. And it did this because it was making a point. Netanyahu did not appreciate that. The reason why is he doesn't care. He's trying to start a war, in Western Asia, general war in Western Asia, so he can drag the United States in because he thinks that we can win the war for him. Meanwhile, I have to say his strategy in all this, including Gaza, has been very misplaced because it has marked Israel as an insufferable apartheid state and war criminal. And himself as a war criminal who's about to be served a warrant from the International Criminal Court. Also, so far, he's not succeeded in dragging us in full blown. He has succeeded in stopping us from saying that we were going to, and from doing, discontinuation of our weapons and ammunition support for Israel. He has been able to stop that because he's used his very well-off allies in this country to threaten both of our political parties with opposition if they do something he doesn't care for. Anyway, going on with the article. Walter Kern, an American novelist and cultural critic, in his 2009 memoir, Lost in the Meritocracy, some meritocracy, but what meritocracy? But anyway, described how, after a sojourn at Oxford, he came to be a member of, quote, the class that runs things, unquote. The one that, quote, writes the headlines and the stories under them, unquote. It was the account of a middle-class kid from Minnesota trying desperately to fit into the elite world, and then, to his surprise, realizing that he didn't want to fit in at all. Now 61, Kern has a newsletter on Substack, I guess he didn't fit in, and co-hosts a lively podcast devoted in large part to critiquing establishment liberalism, quote unquote. His contrarian drift has made him more vocal about his distrust of elite institutions. As he wrote in 2022, quote, for years now, the answer in every situation, quote, Russiagate, unquote, COVID, Ukraine, has been more censorship, more silencing, more division, more scapegoating. It's almost as if these are goals in themselves, and the cascade of emergencies mere excuses for them. Hate is always the way, unquote. Kern's politics, a friend of his suggested, was, quote, old school liberal, unquote, underscoring that it was the other, quote, so-called liberals who had changed. Quote again, I've been told repeatedly in the last year that free speech is a right-wing issue. I wouldn't call Kern conservative. I would just say that he's a free thinker, nonconformist, iconoclastic, unquote, the friend said. To understand Kern's contrarian turn and to make sense of today's form of American politics, it is necessary to understand one key term. It is not found in standard textbooks, but is central to the new playbook of power, the, quote, whole of society, unquote. Quote, the term was popularized, I don't really remember the popularization of that term, but okay, roughly a decade ago by the Obama administration, which liked that its bland, technocratic appearance could be used as a cover to erect a mechanism for governance, quote, whole of society approach, unquote, one that asserts that as actors, media, NGOs, that's non-governmental organizations, corporations, and philanthropist institutions interact with public officials to play a critical role, not just in setting the public agenda, but in enforcing public decisions. Jacob Siegel has explained the historic development of the, quote, whole of society, unquote, approach during the Obama administration's attempt to pivot in the, quote, war on terror, unquote, to what it called, quote, CVE, unquote, countering violent extremism. The idea was to surveil the American people's online behavior in order to identify those who may, at some unspecified time in the future, quote, commit a crime, unquote. I guess it's on that basis that the FBI has been surveilling Scott Ritter, right? Inherent to the concept of the potential, quote, violent extremist, unquote, who has as yet committed no crime is a weaponized vagueness, quote, a cloud of suspicion that hangs over anyone who challenges the prevailing ideological narratives. Okay, if this is the concept, now I guess I have to conclude that both I and every one of the regulars on the Judging Freedom show of Judge Napolitano, every one of the regulars are people who challenge the prevailing ideological narratives. That includes people from across the ideological spectrum. Judge Knapp himself is a known right-wing conservative. Colonel McGregor was a consultant to the Trump administration on military matters. Of course, Scott Ritter has been opposing the ideological narratives of administrations for over 30 years now. And then there is also specifically Ray McGovern and Larry Johnson, And Max Blumenthal and Anya Parampil uh, 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 and Aaron Mate and Karen Kwiatkowski and Phil Giraldi. Are we to conclude a cloud of suspicion hangs over every one of them? Oh, I forgot to mention Jeff Sachs and John Mearsheimer. At this point, I'm at the point of actually wondering whether there is anyone who tells anything like the truth, who doesn't have a cloud of suspicion hanging over them. Going on, what the various iterations of this whole society approach have in common is their disregard for democratic process and the right to free association, their embrace of social media surveillance, and their repeated failure to deliver results, unquote. Aaron Cariati writes, quote, more recently, the whole of society political machinery facilitated the overnight flip from Joe Biden to Kamala Harris, with news media and party supporters turning on a dime when instructed to do so. Democratic primary voters be damned. This happened not because of the personalities of the candidates involved, and I should add, nor because of differences in positions taken by the candidates, but to go back to the article, on the orders of party leadership, the actual nominees are fungible and entirely replaceable functionaries serving the interests of the ruling party. The party was delivered to her because she was selected by its leaders to act as its figurehead. That real achievement belongs not to Harris, but to the party state, unquote. I think that quote is very interesting for a number of reasons, because today I was contemplating uh, the position Harris finds herself in relation to the Israel-Gaza war. She almost seems like she wants to depart from Joe Biden's policy on that war, at least to advocate for a change in policy. But as Joe Biden's vice president, she's kind of trapped in the way Hubert Humphrey was trapped in 1968 when he wanted to depart from the Vietnam policy of Lyndon Johnson, but could not do so. It cost Humphrey the election of 1968. He came very close to beating Nixon, about 30,000 votes in various states that separated them. I seem to remember 30,000, maybe the figure was 60,000, but it was a small number of votes at that time. If he had advocated for changing the policy in Vietnam, no doubt the vice president would have won the election in 1968. Harris is in a similar position today. Sooner or later, she's going to have to face the music of questions exploring her position on Gaza in some depth. Right now, she advocates for a ceasefire, So does Biden. The question is whether Biden means the same thing by ceasefire, okay, as Harris. That's a really key question that we don't know the answer to, okay, at this point. Okay, but anyway, my point here is if the leaders of the Democratic Party and all the people they consult, okay, in the whole of society, the whole of society network, if all of them thought that Harris was not someone wise to select, okay, for example, if all of them had decided on asking Tim Walz himself to be their candidate, then of course he would not have been bound to the policies of Joe Biden and would have had much more freedom to run a convincing campaign. Just a thought, folks. Going on with the article, what has this to do with geopolitics and whether there will be a war between Iran and Israel? Well, quite a lot. It is not just Western domestic politics that has been shaped by the Obama CVE totalizing mechanics, the quote, party state, unquote, machinery, Carriati's term for geopolitics, has also been co-opted. Quote, to avoid the appearance of totalitarian overreach in such efforts, unquote, Carriati argues, quote again, the party requires an endless supply of causes that party officers use as pretext to demand ideological alignment across public and private sector institutions. These causes come in roughly two forms: the urgent existential crisis. Examples include COVID and the much-hyped threat of Russian disinformation, and victim groups supposedly in need of the party's protection, unquote. Quote again, it's almost as if these are goals in themselves, and the cascade of emergencies mere excuses for them. Hate is always the way, unquote, Kern underlines. Just to be clear, the implication is that all geostrategic critics of the party state's ideological alignment must be jointly and collectively treated as potentially dangerous extremists. Once again, folks, that's us. Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, therefore, are bound together as representing a single obnoxious extremism that stands in operation to, quote, our democracy, unquote, versus, quote, our free speech, unquote, and versus, quote, our expert consensus, unquote. So if the move to war against one extremist, i.e. versus Iran, is acclaimed by 58 standing ovations in the joint session of Congress last month, then further debate is unnecessary, any more than the Kamala Harris the nomination as presidential candidate needs to be endorsed through primary voting. Candidate Harris told hecklers on Wednesday, chanting about a genocide in Gaza, quote, to pipe down, unquote, unless they, quote, want Trump to win, unquote. Tribal norms must not be challenged even for genocide. I have to note here that in a later rally, Harris spoke more kindly to hecklers and stated her position as wanting a ceasefire, okay, in Gaza, And she also spent, a bit of time telling them how important it was to hear their voices. In other words, as I recall, the quote here to pipe down was from the Michigan rally, but the later, more friendly and measured reply to the hecklers uh, um, was in the Nevada rally, I believe. So between the two rallies, she had changed her position, evidently, or at least was perhaps more frank about what her real position was, or maybe less frank, depending on how you look at it. Sandra Parker, chairwoman of the political advocacy group, political advocacy arm for the 3,000 members of Christians United for Israel, or CUFI, C-U-F-I, was advising on correct talking points. The Times of Israel reports the rise of Republican far right-wingers who spurn decades of bipartisan pro-Israel orthodoxy, favoring isolationism and resurrecting anti-Jewish tropes, is alarming pro-Israel evangelicals and their Jewish allies. The break with decades of assertive foreign policy was evident last year when Senator Josh Hawley derided, quote, liberal empire, unquote, that he dismissively characterized as bipartisan. Quote, neoconservatives on the right and liberal globalists on the left. Together, they make up what you might call the Uni Party, the DC establishment that transcends all changing administrations, unquote, unquote. At the CUFI Talking Points conference, the fear of increased isolation on the right was the issue. Quote, you're going to see that adversaries will see the U.S. as in retreat, unquote. Should isolationists get the upper hand, activists were advised to push back. Should lawmakers claim that NATO expansion is what triggered Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Quote, should anybody begin to make the argument that the reason the Russians have moved in on Ukraine is because of NATO enlargement? Can I just say that this is the age-old, quote, blame America trope, unquote, unquote? The chair advised the assembled delegates. That's interesting to me because John Mearsheimer, one of our primary analysts in international relations, perhaps today's head of the realism school, has made the argument that the reason the Russians have moved in on Ukraine is because of the attempt at NATO enlargement. And Jeffrey Sachs, who is a noted analyst and, shall I say, exponent of peace and a collaborative foreign policy, not a member of the realist school, absolutely agrees with John Mearsheimer about that. So, going on with the article anyway. Quote, they have the strain of isolationism that's, quote, let's just do China and forget about Iran, forget about Russia, let's just do one thing, unquote. But it doesn't work that way, said Boris Zilberman, Director of Policy and Strategy for the CUFI Action Fund. Instead, he described, quote, an intricate fabric of bad actors working hand in hand, unquote. I guess all of us who think that way are bad actors. Jeez. So to get to the bottom of this Western mind management in which appearance and reality are cut from the same cloth of hostile extremism. Iran, Russia, and China are, quote, cut from it, unquote. Likewise, plainly put, the import of this, quote, behavioral engineering enterprise, it no longer having much to do with the truth, no longer having much to do with your right to desire what you wish or not, but desire what you don't wish, unquote, is, as Kern says, quote again, everyone is in on the game, unquote. Quote, the corporate and state interests don't believe you are wanting the right things. You might want Donald Trump, or that you aren't wanting the things, or that you aren't wanting the things you should want more, unquote, such as seeing Putin removed. If this, quote, whole of society machinery, whole of society, unquote, if this, quote, whole of society, unquote, machinery is understood correctly in the wider world, then the likes of Iran or Hezbollah are forced to take note that war in the Middle East inevitably may bleed across into wider war against Russia and have adverse implications or ramifications, I should say, for China too. This is not because it makes sense. It doesn't. But it's because the ideological needs of, quote, whole of society foreign policy hinge on simplistic moral, quote unquote, narratives, ones that express emotional attitudes rather than argued propositions. Netanyahu went to Washington to lay out the cause for all-out war on Iran. Okay, a moral war of civilization versus the barbarians, he said. He was applauded for his stance. He returned to Israel and immediately provoked Hezbollah, Iran, and Hamas in a way that dishonored and humiliated both, knowing well that it would draw a riposte that would most likely lead to wider war. I couldn't agree more with this last. I mean, that's exactly what happened, exactly what is happening, exactly the problem we have now. Clearly, Netanyahu, backed by a plurality of Israelis, but not a majority, wants an Armageddon with full U.S. support, of course. He has the U.S., he thinks, exactly where he wants it. Netanyahu is only to escalate in one way or another. And Washington, he calculates rightly or wrongly, will be compelled to follow. Is this why Iran is taking its time? The calculus on an internal riposte to Israel is, quote, one thing, unquote. But how then might Netanyahu retaliate in Iran and Lebanon? That can be altogether an, quote, other thing, unquote. There have been hints of nuclear weapons being deployed in both instances. This is, however, nothing solid. There is, however, nothing solid to this latter rumor. Further, how might Israel respond towards Russia in Syria? Or might the U.S. react through escalation in Ukraine? After all, Moscow has assisted Iran with its air defenses, just as the West is assisting Ukraine against Russia. There are many imponderables. Yet one thing is clear. As former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev noted recently, quote, the knot is tightening, unquote, in the Middle East. And the escalation is across all the fronts. War, Medvedev suggested, may be, quote, the only way this knot will be cut. Iran must think that appeasing Western pleas in the wake of the Israeli assassination of Iranian officials at their Damascus consulate was a mistake. Netanyahu did not appreciate the moderation of Iran. He doubled down on war, making it inevitable sooner or later. And there is a video link in the article, okay, to the Judging Freedom program and Alistair Crook's appearance on that program on Monday morning. This was republished from the Strategic Culture Foundation by permission of the author, okay, or representative, okay, of the author. I thought that was a terrific analysis. Very well colored, okay, and layered. It was very rich, okay, in its associations. What I would only point out is that this so-called whole of society approach to policy and to mobilizing society to do particular things seems to me very, very similar to the characterization by Sheldon Wallen, okay, and Chris Hedges of the system we live under now as an inverted totalitarian system. It's so similar in terms of description of the network that actually determines things and governs things, and that undermines our formal democracy. So I leave you with that particular thought when you contemplate whether the war is really inevitable. I should say, I don't believe, okay, in the inevitability of war myself. I am not a determinist. While I think we're in an extremely dangerous type of situation, I also think that there are still choices for Biden, okay, to make, or if not Biden, then at least for Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken to make. I'm pretty sure they want to stay out of war, but they have been feeling very, very imprisoned by the political power, okay, of the lobby, specifically the Israel lobby in AIPAC, in this country, okay, and in the elections coming up. They don't want to lose the election at this point. They do care about that. Though Harris, in letting them know that Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken and Lloyd Austin would all be replaced, she was basically telling them, well, they're going to lose their jobs anyway. So maybe that would bring other considerations into their minds, such as the possible danger to themselves of a war inside, starting in Western Asia, but escalating into World War III. They all know by now the capabilities of the Russian hypersonic missiles. Maybe thoughts of those kinds of capabilities would give them some pause. Okay, I certainly hope so, because whether the election is won by Harris or not, they will be leaving the administration and going into the private sector. So they don't have the job incentive to keep doing what they've been doing. Maybe they'll finally consider what the interest of the people of the United States is. It's certainly not in a general war, okay, in that particular situation. So, where was I? I think I missed something here. So let me see where I am for a moment. Yes, I am missing something. The next piece, which is a common dream. I thought I had it all set up, but I didn't. But now it's here, so I will share it. So the third piece, okay, in my agenda is to consider the question of what the Dems are going to do about Gaza, okay, in their convention. Let me share the screen for that. This is a piece from Common Dreams, forcing Democrats to confront the Gaza genocide in Chicago. It's by James Zogby, the head of the Arab American Institute. Subtitle, okay, is the head of the DNC, the Arab American Institute, and other prominent progressive groups are hosting 3 days of programming on Palestinian rights and U.S. support for Israel. So James Zogby starts off with Democrats are approaching their 2024 convention, are approaching the convention. They're aware of the many critical issues at stake, okay, in this election. There is deep concern with what our second Trump administration would mean for women's rights, civil rights, environmental protections, immigration policy, civil discourse, and the very foundation of our democratic order. To which I have to reply, yeah, what democratic order? That's a question mark. All of these issues and more are discussed at length in the 2024 Democratic Party platform and will be addressed by an assortment of speakers, okay, at the convention, though somehow I doubt that any of those speakers will talk about inverted totalitarianism. Why do I think that? Oh, well. What will not be discussed are the genocide that has been unfolding in Gaza, the continued erosion of Palestinian rights in all the occupied territories, and the role the United States continues to play in supporting Israel's unconscionable violations of international law and U.S. human rights legislation. These are topics that should be addressed, but because they won't, the Arab American Institute, AAI, together with Reverend Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Push organization and a number of other prominent progressive groups, are hosting 3 days of programs during the afternoon hours of Monday through Wednesday. Okay, that's the 19th, 20th, and 21st, before the convention's official proceedings begin. Is that the 19th? Well, yesterday was the 12th, so yes, it's the 19th, before the convention's official proceedings begin. Topics that will be explored during these AAI events are the role of dark money in politics, quote unquote. We'll discuss how pro-Israel groups spent in excess of $35 million this year to smear and defeat 2 progressive black members of Congress who had advocated for Palestinian rights. This problem of dark money has been a growing concern over the past 3 election cycles. I have to say, I'm not sure the $35 million was from dark money. As far as I understand it, it was from super PACs. And all contributions greater than $200 given to super PACs are a matter of public record. I don't think the problem was that the money was dark. I think the problem was it was a very visible public intervention by the very rich in this election, using what super PACs can do based on a decision by the Supreme Court in 2010. The problem of dark money has been a growing concern over the past three election cycles. Twice in Democratic Party meetings, we have tried to pass by resolutions banning its use in primary contests. How could they do that? I mean, the party can't ban its use in primary contests. The reason why I say that is because the money from super PACs doesn't go to campaigns. It's outside of the campaign structure. And as far as the Supreme Court is concerned, it's free speech. I don't think the Democratic Party can do anything about that. Now, maybe Jim Zogby is talking about something different. In both instances, party leaders refused to even allow a debate on the issue. Our concern is that left unchecked, the problem posed by dark money will grow, and before long, not only pro-Israel, but also other special interest groups like Big Pharma, banks, health insurance, etc., will similarly attempt to take advantage of the loophole that allows unlimited amounts of money to flood um, um, our elections. Well, I agree with the general thought here, but not with the idea that it's dark money. Quote, the role of Congress in sponsoring by legislation that silences free speech, unquote. Just as the U.S. policy debate over Israel-Palestine has intensified, pro-Israel groups have worked with some members of Congress and also state legislators to silence voices and penalize elections that are critical of Israel. By expanding the definition of anti-Semitism to include most criticisms of Israel, and by denying Americans the right to boycott or call for sanctions against any country for any reason, free speech is being constrained or outright denied. At this point, over 36 states have passed these laws, and Congress is currently debating legislation that will not only conflate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, but also require universities and other institutions receiving federal funds to establish enforcement mechanisms. By the way, that's almost all of the major universities now. I think it is all the major universities. They're all receiving federal funds. Unless they want to give up the federal funds, they would have to comply with the conflation of a free speech criticizing Israel with anti-Semitism. Quote, the voices of Palestinians who should be heard. After 40,000 Palestinians have been killed, well, of course, the estimate by the Lancet is that that number is probably closer to 183,000. Most of Gaza laid waste and famine on the horizon. What do you mean on the horizon? Famine's on the frickin' street. Democrats need to hear and listen to Palestinians. If the convention won't invite them, they will be at the AAI event so they can tell their story. Quote, an examination of what's not included in the Democratic Party's platform. Arab Americans and those concerned with justice in the Middle East, I wish he would say in West Asia, have been waging battles to shape the political party's positions on Israel/Palestine. We'll look at what changed and what hasn't changed in the past 4 decades. 40 years ago, we couldn't get the word Palestinians in the platform. Now it's in the Democrats' platform, but neither party will include the word occupation or any criticism of Israeli policies. That must change. Quote, the role of Gaza war is playing in changing public opinion and its impact on the future of the Democratic Party. Israel's genocidal war in Gaza has become central to the agenda of progressives in the Democratic Party. Polls show that there are majorities of Democrats who are opposed to Israel's conduct of the war in Gaza want a ceasefire and a conditioning of U.S. aid to Israel and support justice and rights for Palestinians. These numbers are largely driven by young voters, by progressive Jewish groups, and Black, Latino, and Asian and Arab Americans, all of whom are important to Democratic victories. In addition to the 3-day AAI event, there will be other events hosted by groups seeking to pressure the establishment to change direction on a variety of issues of concern, but AAI's is the only one that will challenge the party to confront, quote, the elephant in the room, unquote, our unquestioning support for Israel in its unrelenting genocidal war in Gaza. It's an issue that the majority of Democrats want the party to discuss and a policy they want the administration to change. I think that all that is good and is right, but I would add that there's another elephant in the room, and that element is AIPAC and its comrades in the Israel lobby. That's the other elephant in the room. They will be very much present at the Democratic convention. They will be very much looking over things. They will be very much observing who is not adhering to the party line, to their party line, and who is. And they are the other elephant in that room. So, I did want to point that out and also let you know that there is this 3-day event that will be going on trying to influence the convention to a more just and fair position towards the Palestinians. That is, I think, a good thing. And my final piece for tonight, wow. There are a decent number of people here, but there are very few comments, and I'm not sure why. There are just a couple of hellos. But anyway, I will go to my final piece of the evening. This is a piece by Yanis Varoufakis, the economist and former finance minister of Greece, and the motivator, of the democracy movement in Europe. An urgent question for ICC judges. When will you act on Israel's war crimes? This appeared in Common Dreams on August 10th. And the subtitle is, if you don't act now, what is the point of having the ICC? This is a very short one and won't take up too much of your time. There's an editor's note. The following is based on a social media post on Saturday, August 10th, following news of the latest bombing of a school shelter in Gaza by Israeli military forces. Dear International Criminal Court judges, it is now beyond dispute Israel has set out systematically to eliminate every aspect of Palestinian life in Gaza. It is not just the 186,000 lives that the Lancet estimates to have been lost. It is more than that. You have already witnessed one the most intensive bombing of any densely populated urban area in living memory, the deliberately targeted starvation of the population in post-World War II history, the greatest number of journalists killed in any war worldwide, and four, the largest number of UN staff killed in 10 months. And that's not all. Israel attacks schools, also universities, libraries, archives, cultural centers, heritage sites, mosques, and churches. It assassinates professors and slaughters teachers, along with their students, often their entire families too. When will you act? Okay, Giannis also tweeted, Israel has now killed nearly 40,000 Palestinians, mostly women and children, wounded well over 92,000 others. Thousands more lie uncounted under the debris. Some 10,000 Palestinians have been abducted by Israel's occupying forces. Question, where is the ICC indictment? If you don't act now, leaving the tweet and going on with the article, if you don't act now, what is the point of having the ICC? If you don't act now, is there a smidgen of an iota of a possibility that anyone will take the ICC seriously in the future? I thank Giannis Varoufakis for bringing that question to the notice, of everyone. He is prominent enough that more and more people will be asking that particular question, as we all should be asking right now. Where are the warrants? Why weren't the warrants served on Netanyahu when he came to the United States? I believe the ICC indictment of Netanyahu has been made, but no warrants have been issued. There were people in Congress ready to serve those warrants on Netanyahu when he appeared. Why weren't they there? Well, that's my last piece for tonight. I will look at your comments. There are only two, both on YouTube. Steve saying hello, and Dee saying hello. Hi, Dee. So anyway, I guess that's going to wind it up for tonight. I won't see you tomorrow. I still have other pending business that I have to take care of, which seems to be continuous and I think will be for a number of weeks now. So I will be back on Thursday with another show. Right now, I think it will be on domestic politics, but of course, we are waiting for the international situation to explode. So if it explodes between now and then, it will probably be on international relations once more. But for now, oh, well, thank you, Dee. I certainly appreciate that. So for now, I'm going to say goodnight, and I'll see you all on Thursday.